is going to be on every slide.
You want me to minimize it so that you can see? Yeah.
Because we'll end up cutting off
Yeah, that's
stuff.
true.
Yeah.
So he does that because we're like streaming, but once we start going, I'll just tell him that we need to see.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming again to the second steering committee meeting of the comprehensive plan. We have tonight with us our consultants from RKG Associates. They're going to give a little bit of a background about themselves and their firm and what the work they're doing for us, but we basically started a contract with them earlier this year to perform the economic development market analysis, and they're doing a lot of the data crunching and forecasting so that I don't have to do the math and all the data things, and we can focus more on some of the softer side of living in Sanford, and the mapping things was what is more in my wheelhouse. So I think with that, I'll just let you guys go ahead and take it away. Sure. This microphone also works if you guys don't want to stand, but it's up to you.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Wasiges with RKG Associates, and I'm joined here with Eric, who's also from RKG Associates, and I guess just for a little bit of background, this presentation, as Aaron mentioned, will be a bit data heavy, so I apologize in advance. This is, I guess, the way you can think about it is this is the first segment of the work that we're doing for the economic development plan. So this is just sort of setting a baseline understanding of major industries, employment trends, how those factor into broader economic trends, what's happening with households and demographics, and then using that sort of information, we'll start to work into what we think about as potential uses in terms of space, industries to target, workforce opportunities, and things of that nature. And so with that, we have this broken down, and as I mentioned, this will be a bit data heavy, so I think our plan here is we'll go through each section, and I'll kind of talk through each of the slides, and then maybe I'll just pause and see if anyone has any questions. Feel free to ask as many questions as you want. I know this will be a lot that we're going to throw at you all at once. So we want to make this as helpful and constructive as possible. And so to get a sense of what we're going to be talking about, the first will just be sort of a broad overview, talking about Sanford, York County, and sort of broadly what we're seeing in terms of demographic trends. And then we'd be interested, from your perspective, do you feel like this is true in your experience in Sanford? And then from that, we'll sort of talk about the labor market and jobs, and then from there, what does that look like in terms of employment demand and as a result, demand for space? And that's when Eric's going to start to get into, when we think about employment and economic activity, how does that translate into real estate, the demand for space, the use of space, and what are some ways of thinking through strategies that could best utilize existing space? And then finally, we'll talk in the end with single and multifamily. We'll talk about households, housing, and sort of the broader trends there as well. And so with that, to kick things off, I do want to talk a little bit about scope, just so you get a sense as I'm referencing different geographies throughout this presentation. A lot of the data, well, pretty much all of the data that we're pulling is focusing on Sanford, and then we're benchmarking that against York County. I know that York County and many of the communities in York County aren't necessarily the same as Sanford, but for the purposes of looking at census data, when we're looking at real estate markets, these all sort of align from that perspective. So we're going to talk about those things from the scale of Sanford and York County, but then further on as we go through the analysis and some of the later portions, then we can start to think about, in places similar to Sanford, how is space used in this way, or are there certain strategies to leverage what's already existing in terms of existing assets. So that'll be something of a later discussion. So to sort of kick things off really broadly, really the important thing on this slide is the figure on the left. If you're looking at the population over time from 2010 to 2022, and again, this is a little bit delayed because it's census data, so it's lagged by a little bit, but this is our best measure that we have of sort of the direction of population through time. As you can see, it's pretty flat, and then all of a sudden in 2020 to 2022, it starts to spike up. The way we understand this is, as I'm sure you've seen in the news or thinking about the activity in the housing market, from COVID-19 pandemic, working from home, lower rates at that point in time, there was a lot of movement of people buying homes, moving around, and we've seen that in a lot of places. You see a spike in population due to people moving from other metro areas or other areas of the state or other states and looking to buy homes, and that sort of has led to that drive in population growth. And the figure on the right, which I'm sure is no surprise to all of you, Sanford is one of the most populous communities in York County. And so when I'm talking about population, the reason why I wanted to start with that is the figure on the left, I know it's just a lot of jagged lines. The thing I really want to highlight about that is the way to think about that line is you're looking at the number of people in each age from 0 to 100. And so the highest parts of those lines represent the most people are of that age group. So as you can see, where the arrows that I pointed out, the peak in the green that goes from 50 to about 60 to about 70. The way you can think about that is that's simply residents. They took the census in 2000 and they were 50. They took it again in 2010, they were 60, and so forth and so on. So that's sort of just a signal of an aging existing population of residents. The interesting thing that I want to point out is the peaks on the further on the left. You see in 2000, there was a lot of folks that were under 25, from 0 to 25. Then the red line shows that there weren't as many people, but then the yellow shows another spike, and that's from about 25 to 35. So Sanford, in the most recent census, it showed an influx of residents who are in that sort of moving into peak home buying years, working, typically out of school. So there's that, and they're also, that's the age where family formation starts to happen. So that's definitely an important indicator when we're thinking about the housing market, the workforce, that kind of thing. And then the figure on the right's just showing that yellow line a different way, and it's just showing the proportion of people, male and female, throughout the entire population of Sanford, which by the dips and bumps you can see that where it's really wide, that's that older population that I was just mentioning. And then if you go down a little bit, you see in the 30s, there's that other bump, which is another spike in population. And so, thinking about population in terms of households, what this figure is showing is the number of households in every community in York County, and it's showing you them in the portion of renters and homeowners. So how many renters and homeowners in each town, and then it just gives you a magnitude of, if you compare Sanford to York to Alfred, like just what the scale of that actually is. And as you can see, Sanford is predominantly owners, but the important thing too is that Sanford has a lot of renters relative to a lot of the other communities, meaning that a lot of people within York County that are renters, they are most likely renting in somewhere like Sanford, Biddeford, etc. And Eric will explain a little when we get to the housing section why that is of note. And so a little bit more about age and demographics about the people in Sanford. As I mentioned, Sanford started to see that change. What you're seeing here on the left is household size, so 1 person, 2 person, 3 person, 4 person households. And what those figures are showing is the change across the decade using census estimates. And what this is really showing is that the green bars, which represent owner households, you can see an increase in 1 person households and 3 person households. And as I mentioned before, some of the really notable trends are aging residents as well as younger residents that are in that sort of early family formation years, which would be your 2 to then 3 person, 4 person household. So, sure.
On the owners, if you
Yes.
have an owner who's in one bracket,
Yes.
but also then you have the other owner in the other bracket, are they double counted?
No, those are different households.
No. So my husband's not the same years as me. How would we be counted? So I'm, for example, in the 45 to 54, but he's in the 55 to 64.
Oh, I see.
We both own the house. Where does that fall in that data?
Sure. So the way the census benchmarks that is by head of householder, and so usually that comes down to whoever filled out the survey is usually how that goes.
That's
Yeah.
important. That's important to know.
Absolutely.
Usually it's the wife, but that's
Yeah. So, yeah, and that's why we try to show this both in terms of population, so people, and then households, because there is, as you just mentioned, that distinction. Oftentimes it comes down to who filled out the survey.
Got it.
because the first name on it will be the head of the household. And so then, so to that point, the figure on the right, that's showing by head of household the age of those householders, both for renters and owners. And as would be no surprise, typically owners tend to be a bit older than renters. Usually they're later on in their careers, or they've been owning for a while, so that's why you usually see that divergence. And then, looking at this another way, this is looking at households by household type. And by type, I just mean family and non-family, and the definition of family is simply people who are related living in the household versus non-family would be like a couple of roommates. And as you can see here, the real noticeable change is in that red bar on the left figure of family households. That went up quite a bit, and that sort of coincides with what we've seen with the growth in three-person households and in younger households. So it all plays to this narrative of younger households buying and being of a three-person, four-person family household. And then another interesting way of looking at this is when people move to Sanford. And so the way this works is when you fill out the census survey, it asks you when did you move into your home, and then based on and if you're an owner or renter, and based on that, you get a sense of when did households move to Sanford. And so the interesting thing here is, as you can see, owners, it's a pretty consistent sort of number of new households moving to Sanford since pre-1990, from 1990 to 1999, et cetera. But what's really striking is if you look at the renter households, it's really been in the last 2 decades that a lot of renters have moved to Sanford. And so that's another thing that I just want to call out. And again, as Eric gets to the multifamily side, it'll be interesting to talk through that a little bit more. Okay, and then another way of looking at households is based on income. And one of the things which I'll get into when I start talking about the workforce, one of the interesting things that you see in terms of changes in household income is the red bars towards the right of the figure. There's a lot of increase in higher income households. And I should mention, as a function of time and time value of money, if you take the census one year and then you take it a few years later, you will most likely fall into a new income bucket just because of the way that wage growth occurs. But when you start to see these huger gaps like this, that is more of a signal of there is some level of new households that are of higher income moving into the city. And that really correlates with educational attainment. As you can see on the top of the figure where there's bachelor's and graduate degrees, there's been an increase over the decade, which is usually pretty linked with household income, home ownership. And so you can kind of start to see how some of these sort of link to show that trend. And then, again, as Eric will talk about in the housing market, we definitely see that with competition for homes, the rising prices, and that sort of thing in the housing market. And so I guess I'll just pause there because I know I'm sure I went through that a little quickly. So any questions? I'm also happy to pan back to slides. Sure.
We're trying to use the microphones in case. Oh, there you go. We're using microphones for questions. Thank you.
It looked like your census data was 2017, 2022. Is there any more up-to-date information, or is that the most up-to-date that you guys have available?
Yeah, so that's the challenge. The census data is usually lagged by a couple of years. So in December, this coming December, 2023 is released, and then the next year, 2024 is released. And so the thing I really like to underscore with census data, especially when we're talking about ACS data, that's just a sample. It's not the full count like the decennial census in 2020 was. The really important way to think about it is just direction and magnitude of change, not necessarily the exact number, because most likely that number will be off from the exact number of people in that demographic. The important thing is, did it go up by a lot? Did it go down by a lot? And thinking about the magnitude and direction of that change. And then that's sort of what we use when we're thinking about what that would mean for the market.
Hey, so I had a question. So with the increase in in rentals, is that like an increase in were you able to tell if that was an increase, like there were more rentals being built, or were houses that were previously being owned by residents instead now being rented out to different people?
Sure. So that's a little bit of both, and we have a whole section that's going to directly address that. So in a few slides, we can talk about that.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay. Okay, great. So then moving on to the labor market, I'm going to sort of frame this first by people commuting patterns, where are people going to work, whether that's outside of Sanford or inside of Sanford, and then I'm going to talk about what industries do they work in, and then sort of how that factors into economic activity, and then again, how that'll translate into space and thinking about strategies for economic development. And so to sort of kick things off, the first thing, the figure on the top with the arrows, the yellow represents people who live elsewhere and work in Sanford. So these are commuting from outside of Sanford, working in Sanford. The blue circle is people who live and work in Sanford. And then in the red, it's much wider because there are more people leaving for work on a given day than there are coming in. And those are people who live in Sanford and work somewhere else. And we have a few maps so you can get a sense of where people are going. But the figure below is just kind of showing you the top 10 share of places of where people are coming from, such as Waterboro, Biddeford, Wells, Acton, and then where they're going to for work, which is Portland, North Berwick, Kennebunk, Biddeford. And so to give you a sense of what this looks like spatially, these red dots, you could just think about it as representing a number of jobs of where someone's originating from. And so the red dots in Sanford, those represent people who live and work in Sanford. So they're living and commuting right in the city. And then outside of the city where you see the red dots, that's where people are coming from outside of Sanford, around York County and further into Sanford for work. And then what's interesting is when you think about where people are coming from to work in Sanford, let's see. Sorry, there we go. Here is the opposite, where people are going to for work coming from Sanford. And this is probably not much of a surprise to most of you. A lot of people living in Sanford are commuting all the way to Portland, South Portland, down to Biddeford, Kennebunk, and then all the way down to Portsmouth and Kittery as well. And so when we're thinking about who's commuting into Sanford, who's commuting out of Sanford, the question then is, what do they do for work? And so to sort of benchmark that, we're looking at jobs numbers from 2019 and then 2023. Again, those are the most recently available jobs that we can get. As you can see, some of the most notable sectors are things like healthcare and social assistance, manufacturing, construction, government, in terms of industries in Sanford. And then if you look on the far column on the right, you can get a sense of the share of workers in York County, how many of those workers are represented by workers in Sanford. And some of the notable ones there are retail trade, which you can see is around 17%, healthcare and social assistance, manufacturing, and construction. And so one way of thinking about this is, as I was talking before a little bit about where people are commuting to and where they're commuting from, and then now what do they do? Here's a sense of comparing those two things. And so what you're looking at here is in the green bar, this is the industry that a Sanford resident is working in, and then the red bar is someone who works in Sanford is working in. And so mind you, in this case, some of those might be the same. Someone might be living and working, and they're in that same industry. But in this case, it's where there's the big differences that are really interesting. If you look at towards the bottom, arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and food service, there are more people who are working in Sanford in those jobs than people who live in Sanford with those jobs. And so that means people working in those industries are commuting from outside of Sanford into Sanford for that employment, as opposed to if we look at professional, scientific, and technical services, which is up a few from the one I was just mentioning, there are more residents with that working in that industry that don't work in Sanford in that industry. And so when you think about on the slide before, when I was saying a lot of people are leaving Sanford for work every day. You know, in some of those industry sectors, they're going all the way up to Portland or all the way down to Portsmouth or Kittery for a lot of those jobs. And so another thing, when we're sort of talking about the workforce and labor market, this is usually a typical indicator just as a baseline contextual item. And so this is looking at unemployment rates. You know, really the notable thing, again, I'm sure is not much surprise to many of you. There was a rise in unemployment that occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic. The important thing there is the sectors that were most affected by that, and many of the people in the arts, entertainment, retail, accommodation, and food service, those were the jobs that were really impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're seeing today those industries are still recovering from what those employment numbers were pre-COVID-19. And so I know there's a lot going on here, but one way of, if I just was going to boil down everything that I've been talking about to what's really important in talking about all these employment numbers and the flows of workers, is thinking about where are the strengths and weaknesses in terms of a employment perspective. And so what this figure is showing you is if we were to look at employment change and then the specialty of employment and the level of employment of various industries, how do those factor? And so what you're seeing on this figure, I have a little box on the left to give you a sense of how you would read this figure. The larger the employment sector is and the more growth that it's had, those are both positive indicators. And so that would be a strong and advancing industry, or if there's a little bit less employment but it's really growing, then that would be strong and emerging. I think I'm blocking the text for part of that on the figure, but I wanted to call this out for York County first, just to give you a sense of some of the really strong competitive sectors in York, because then when we start to talk about Sanford, it'll be important to sort of put that within the broader context of York County. And so again, those big bubbles in green, those are the real strong sectors: government, manufacturing, retail trade, construction, which is something I'm going to highlight in a few slides later, as well as arts, entertainment, and recreation. And so again, I apologize, there's tons of text and figures in this table, but really the takeaway of looking at this is, as I mentioned on this slide, these bubbles, I don't know if you can see my cursor, yes? These are some of the really strong industries, and these are some of your sort of growing, emerging industries. And then when we start to think about how those industries are growing compared to the national average, are they growing in some way that's above just what you would see as national growth in a sector? Because, you know, there is some level of, if biotech is growing nationally, you know, it's kind of the concept of the tide raises all boats. You'll sort of see growth broadly across that sector. So what we want to know is there a unique level of growth happening in York County and then in Sanford relative to that national growth? And so that's what these sets of bars over here sort of indicate. And really the only important thing here to highlight is if it's green and really far to the right versus if it's red and really far to the left. If it's green and really far to the right, that means that it's exceeding national growth averages and expectations, so that means it's very competitive. And if it's red and really on the far left, that would mean that it's declining faster than national averages. And so the highlight there is, again, you know, thinking about those competitive sectors I mentioned here. It's in manufacturing, retail trade. Agriculture is also really growing quite strongly throughout York County, as well as construction. And then healthcare is on a decline and declining faster than national averages, which is of note because more broadly, healthcare is in demand and growing in many places. So in contrast to that, throughout York County, it's actually on the decline. And so, you know, I go through all that, and it's, why does that all matter? I think a really important way of thinking about this is, what are the needs of actual businesses in York County, and are they meeting those needs? And so what I'm showing you here is, given sort of that context I'm giving you about the industries and where people are commuting to and from, what you're looking at here is job postings and jobs profiles. And so the easiest way to think about this is if you were to sum up all the jobs on, say, Indeed, and compare that against all of the profiles on LinkedIn for each industry sector, are there more profiles or are there more postings? And so if there's more postings than there are profiles, then that means that there's a real need for workers in those industries. Businesses aren't filling those jobs, as opposed to if there are more profiles than postings, then that means that there's more workers in that field than there are a need for jobs in that field. And so I go through all that just to say, if you sort of notice some of these ones at the top, those are really what I want to call out. Healthcare, that red bar is really far to the right compared to the green bar, so that's really showing that there's this high demand for healthcare jobs, but the number of people who have that background is not as high as that demand. So there's a deficit in workers in that field. And then as you sort of go down, you can see in transportation, material moving, and warehousing, there's a similar high need, but there's not enough people to fill those jobs. Similarly true with food prep and service, as well as construction and manufacturing jobs. And so this is just to give you a sense of the far bar on the right is just showing you the difference between these bars. So as you can see with healthcare, there's a big gap between the red and the green. That is reflected in the big line on the red in the first row of that table. And the reason why I highlight this is just to show if we're looking at that sort of surplus or deficit in workers, another interesting thing to think about is how many employers are competing for workers in those jobs. And as you can see, especially for healthcare, there are a lot of employers posting jobs and not finding workers in that industry. And then conversely, if you sort of start to go down and you look more in like the office, computer, mathematical, education, there's actually more people with that background than there are active job postings. And this is just another way of looking at the same thing. This is just looking at job profiles on the bottom and then going up and down. That's looking at postings. And I frame it this way just to show the different sort of gradients of supply and demand. So if you're looking in the top right, it's really high demand, high supply because there are tons of postings and then there would be tons of profiles. But obviously there isn't really much over there. But just to set that as a level set, if we go down, the really important and honestly the only part I want to underscore is down over here. There are a number of postings and there is a low supply of workers. And these are, again, just really underscore those specific set of jobs. And, you know, when you start to think about, you know, what does this all mean when you have a situation where you have a high demand for a certain type of job and a really low supply, you know, this could mean opportunities for upskilling, talent development, bolstering capacity of educational pipelines. So this is where this starts to think about, we have all this data, what do we do with this? Why is this really important to cover? And so it's thinking through that sort of relationship of supply and demand and by industry sector. And so now that's sort of to give you the scope of York County. If we were to then drive down into specifically Sanford, we're looking through the same lens as we did previously, just to give you a sense of what's the most competitive industries, manufacturing, retail trade, accommodation and food service. Those industries really stand out for Sanford, both within York County as well as benchmarked against national averages. And then the one I really want to highlight is this one over here. Construction's a strong and growing industry in York County. It's an emerging industry here in Sanford as well, and I'll sort of get into a little more of that detail in a few more slides. I know I'm going through a lot, so I'm just going to take a second. Does anyone have any questions on that thus far? I do have a few more slides, but I do want to pause for a moment.
So I was wondering, so like obviously there's a very, very big disparity or a significant disparity between how the supply and demand for like healthcare workers and stuff like that. At what point, if it does become a problem, at what point does it become a potential issue when either the supply is way too much compared to the demand or the demand is way too much compared to the supply? Is there a point where that becomes, oh, that's not very good, that's kind of an issue?
Sure. So I guess a good example I could give you of that is, if we're thinking about retail or like a small retailer or a restaurant, if there is a really low supply of workers, typically the way you would try to entice more workers is offer better wages or higher wages, or in some way try to offer more to incentivize someone to take that job. The issue is if there's no one to take that job, you often have to spread your pool broader and broader, and then the issue is the further someone has to commute, the more they're going to need as a wage. And the issue is, as say a small business owner, the more you would have to pay, and you would potentially reach a ceiling in what you're able to pay for that to work. And so then it becomes an issue of, am I going to be able to pay for the labor I need for whatever service I'm delivering in a way that I'm still profitable?
Thank you.
One of the constants I've noticed in Sanford's unemployment rate was that it was always higher than the state and the national. But a couple of years ago, I noticed that it was lower, and I don't know if it stayed that way because I don't look that often, but I just wondered if you knew anything about that or what might explain it.
Sure. So to give you so the interesting thing that we've found working, when we're working a lot of places, it really depends on the industry mix of residents. Because, so this is a sort of nerdy aspect of surveys. When you look at the unemployment rate is based on the unemployment rate in a town, of the residents in town. Are you working or are you not? But then when we're looking at jobs, those are based on employers giving numbers to the state. So they're talking about two different things. And so I say this all to say, when we're looking at the unemployment rate, it matters what people in town are doing for work. And so in an instance where, like in the COVID-19 pandemic, if a large share of residents work in sectors that were really impacted by the pandemic, like food service, retail trade, these types of things, unemployment would shoot up for those folks. But if you had a resident population that mostly worked office jobs or in professional services, and could just shift to remote work, you won't see that same level of spike. And so I don't think that fully addresses your question. Does that answer it?
What do your numbers show as the unemployment rate compared to the state and the national?
Yeah. And so in the case of Sanford, the unemployment rate is tracking slightly above the county and the state average, because a lot of residents work in a lot of jobs that were required to be in person, and so that's the pandemic. And then in a lot of those jobs that are things like food service, retail, there's a lot of turnover, and so on any given month that unemployment is tracked, that unemployment rate could be high because there's lots of turnover in those sectors.
Could that be seasonal?
Yes, absolutely. And so that's the other thing I should mention here. The challenge with, and this is again a challenging of the way this data is surveyed. This is the best way that it can be tracked. When you hear about employment numbers on the news, they're doing it the same way. The unfortunate thing is, for data that's lower than the county level, it's not seasonally adjusted. So as you just mentioned, some of this is also factored by seasonal unemployment. So if agriculture is a really strong sector, as is in the case of York County, you can see fluctuations in unemployment, and that's simply turnover from seasonal workers. Any other questions before I go on? Feel free to stop me at any point. I know a lot of this is dense and I'm throwing a million charts at you, so I want to make sure that I'm answering everyone's questions. And so to kind of follow that same framework that we used when I was talking about York County, as we're thinking about the strongest sectors in Sanford, how did these compare to the national average? And so again, the column I really want to call out is this one on the far right. Again, the important thing is it really green or is it really red? And based on that, we can get a sense of, is it growing above or below national expectation. And so I want to call this out to show that manufacturing and retail trade, the interesting thing here is nationally, both these industries are seeing declines. In Sanford, you're not seeing the same level of declines, if at all, depending on the sector within manufacturing, like you're seeing more broadly with the nation. And so that's really something that's very interesting. And again, as we start to talk later on about strategies and thinking about space and economic development more broadly, this is something that's really good to call out because it highlights where the strengths are. And then another one that I really want to call out is construction. And again, this is also partially a function of how crazy the housing market's been. Home builders and a lot of construction related to building residential has really been booming because there's such a demand for both single family and multifamily, and for businesses in Sanford as well as broadly in York County, they've really sort of benefited from this boom in demand. And so again, this is just to kind of show.
Wait, we have questions, and I think is this saying that we have 500 people that we need to hire in the government? Is that what your question is, Jamie?
My question is, on the previous slide,
Yeah.
it showed retail was up by 271.
Yep.
Is that retail jobs in Sanford or people that live in Sanford that work in retail in general?
So this is another one of the challenges, why I was really just focusing on the magnitude. So the way to think about this is you have a national growth rate for an industry. Just for the illustrative purposes, say it's 2% for retail. So you have that national growth rate for retail. If you apply that 2% to Sanford and then you look at Sanford's actual growth, what was the delta between those two? And so if it's higher, then you were growing more than the national average, and if it's lower, you were growing less. Or the same could be true for the decline. So what this is basically saying is Sanford outperformed the national expected average for retail by 271 jobs.
Hi. So one of the trends I think that this is kind of showing, you haven't touched on it yet, we hear a lot over and over again that Southern Maine is really a tourism-based economy. Sanford is not exactly positioned to be, the high attraction for tourism in York County. That's obviously on the beaches. But what we're seeing here, I think, with the unemployment rate kind of fluctuating, spiking high in the first quarter of the year when tourism all throughout Maine takes a bit of a dip, and then also with the increase in retail, the increase in our competitive advantage in the location quotient analysis in retail and in food service and accommodations, it's sort of reinforcing that Sanford is subject to that tourism economy, that we're both benefiting from the competitive advantages for being a part of Southern Maine, but also suffering in the first quarter of each year because that's when our unemployment rate spikes. Typically, it's less than the United States average, typically better than Maine over the last 10 to 15 years, except in that first quarter. So I'm wondering if there's a part of your analysis that we'll get to kind of talking about the tourism aspect of this and how our economy is kind of subject to it.
Yes. So actually, I'm glad you brought that up. In analyzing tourism and visitation patterns and seasonal rentals, that's something that we don't have here in this first analysis, but that is a core component to something that we're going to look at. What was just said there really highlights how we're basically going from looking at these numbers, sort of translating what that would mean in terms of it's clear that there's some influence to tourism. How does that pan out? And so that's one way we're going to look into those numbers with in terms of retail trade. And the other thing I'd say too is what's interesting is with the boom of seasonal rentals, there's obviously tons of tourism happening on the coast, but Maine has been seeing seasonal rentals everywhere, and that's been causing a lot more types of trips to and from the beach and around Southern Maine, and so that's also could be a function of where some of this is coming from, and that is something we're going to take a deeper look into as well. Thank you for mentioning that. And so the last couple of slides, these are just to sort of give you a more detailed sense of when I'm talking about manufacturing being very competitive, this just gives you a more detailed look at what types of industries within manufacturing, rather than just broadly manufacturing is doing well, or retail, et cetera. And so what you're looking at here is, if I were to break down manufacturing a little bit more and see what the different types of manufacturing industries are, where are there the highest levels of employment, and then the figure on the right is showing you gross regional product. The way you can think about this is it's the same as GDP, but on a regional level, and really all that is to say it's just the total output. How much business activity, how much is being spent, how much goods are being produced, how many businesses are involved in producing those goods. So this is just sort of a benchmark number for that level of activity. So the important thing here is just to think the bigger the bar, the more economic activity is coming from that sector. And so as you can see, plastics and rubber products are a really big output and also a high employer. Fabricated metals, textiles, and then food manufacturing are some of the notable ones towards the top in terms of employment as well as economic activity. Similarly, if we look at retail trade, a ton of activity is coming from simply just grocery stores, as well as gas stations, warehouse clubs. Think about, what is it, like BJ's, that kind of thing. And then the other notable one that I want to really underscore here is building materials and supplier dealers. There has been a lot of economic activity in that segment of retail trade, and that is strongly linked to the growth in the construction industry. It's contractors going to Home Depot, buying tons of lumber, and then using that on a site, and just that over and over and over again is reflected in that sort of broader economic activity number that you see on the right there. And then to sort of drive that home a little further, speaking to construction, as you can see, the one that's the highest employed in Sanford and has the biggest output, that's in your residential building construction, followed by building equipment contractors and then specialty trade contractors, all of which are involved in the construction of single and multifamily housing. And then with that, I will hand it over to Eric to start talking about what the implications are in terms of these jobs and these trends that I've been giving you. What does that mean in terms of how it translates into space, and what that's meant in terms of performance in the real estate market? Oh yeah, I guess I should pause too. Any questions? I forgot about that. I'm happy to pan back to any slides too, even if you just want to take a longer look at one of them.
We are also planning to send these slides out at some point right in the future,
Yes.
once we get them. So
Yes.
you'll all have a copy of them. You can digest them at your own speed and font size.
So I've been sitting here thinking about the food manufacturing was one of the big growth segments, and I'm not correlating it. I don't know what falls in that category as to where that growth is.
Sure. Yeah, I don't have the list of industry. I don't think I included those here, but I can certainly add that here and give you a sense of what those. Again, some of these broader categories, some things might not intuitively seem like they fall in that category, but it's just the way the BLS categorizes things. So I can include that just to give you a sense of that.
Okay. There we go. Is that loud enough? Okay, perfect. I know that was about half of the presentation. That is a lot. So I want to just take a quick step back and maybe mention why we're pulling all this information and why it's useful for us. Hopefully it's useful for you when we send the deck out and you can sort of peruse it at your own speed. Eric presented, I was just taking some notes and thinking a little bit about that. I mean, Eric presented, I think, a couple of key things that when we think about economic development and the assets that Sanford has, and also the city's ability to retain what it has today and hopefully in the future continue to grow its economy in different ways. It's really interesting. People who live here, as you saw, a lot of them some of them work here and they do different things, but a lot of them are commuting out, and they're commuting fairly far distances. So as we start to think about the opportunities for Sanford in our next step of the process, is there a way to figure out what are those people doing? Why are they leaving? And what are they doing when they leave and where they go to their job? Is there an opportunity to try to bring those types of employers here? Those people already live here and they're here. Is there an opportunity, even if it's at a small scale, doesn't have to be landing a corporate headquarters, but it could be small bites at the apple to just start bringing more of those jobs here. So that's one thing. The other thing that's interesting is a lot of the folks that work in Sanford are commuting. If you saw that dot density map looked totally different from where people are commuting in from versus where Sanford residents are commuting out to. The out commuters were like the big cities along the coast. The in commuters were much more rural locations all around York County, and they're coming from somewhat far distances. So as you're thinking about the comprehensive plan, we're just one little piece of your comprehensive plan, right? There's a whole land use section and zoning and housing. So is there a reason why retail and food and accommodation workers have to come in from a much further distance and they're not here? Is the housing too expensive here? Is there not enough housing availability here? Those kinds of questions are things that we want you to think about. So we're trying to feed you some of that information, and we'll do some of that analysis as well. The education and income is really interesting. So residents who have come in who live here and have moved here over the last 5 or 10 years, they have a higher level of educational attainment, so more residents with bachelor's degrees, graduate degrees, and you also saw a correlation of income. So household incomes have gone up, particularly for those households that earn above $100,000 a year. So to us, from the economic development side, while that has had an impact on your housing costs, so I don't want to minimize that because that is a real impact, those are also households who are earning more. Therefore, they're able to often spend more on stuff, buying stuff, going to restaurants, personal services, whatever it might be. So from an economic development standpoint, as we think about how do we fill vacant spaces in downtown or in the mill buildings, bringing in people to live here or even to visit here or to work here who have more money can also be a good economic development strategy. And the last piece I would say, and we'll get to this, is around housing affordability and sort of what role does housing play, not just from people who want to live here, but from the employer and economic standpoint. If employers can't get people into housing that they can afford based on what Eric was saying, employers can only pay so much before they're going to either break even or lose money, and they're not in business to lose money. So as we think about housing, how do we have enough affordable housing? And I say affordable, not necessarily always deed restricted affordable, so it's set to the income, but affordable housing, there's a certain price point where someone making $3 million can't afford a home. So affordable housing is all relative to what you make. So if you make $100,000, there is a price point that is not affordable to you. Just like if you make $15,000, there's a lot more price points that aren't affordable to you. So just thinking about all those connections in the data that Eric presented will hopefully lead us toward opportunities, and what are the opportunities that Sanford can take advantage of.
Yeah. Did your survey take into consideration about what type of training perhaps people may be going through? So for example, I might have a job today. I'm commuting to Portland, great job. I'd rather work here in town. I'm training to be something completely different. And so how do we find out what people are training for? And when you look at even, not necessarily even, an older workforce, but even the younger people that are coming out of high school, what are they training for? What do they want to be? Where do they want to live? And do we have the jobs here to support that?
Yep, great question. There are data sources that we have access to that can, similar to what Eric showed with the job openings versus the number of people who could potentially fill those job openings, that sort of delta. We can also look at skills based on people's resumes, and we can compare the skills that are listed on a job posting on Indeed.com or on websites, and then we can compare it to the resumes of people that are out there online through, say, LinkedIn, and the program that we have access to compares those and can do a mismatch on skills. So it doesn't necessarily tell us what people are currently training for, but we could compare the skills of the workforce to the skills of the jobs and see if there's a misalignment there. So we can do that. Sure. Okay. So the next segment of the presentation starts to translate a lot of what Eric talked about into actual real estate opportunities and market opportunities. So first we'll talk a little bit about employment. So This slide might look familiar, but the update is we're looking at job counts from these, and these are job projections by the company that we use. These are jobs from 2024 to 2034. So Eric showed you jobs, I think, from 2019 to 2023. Now we're going to fast forward 10 years and start to think about, based on past trends, how the job composition in Sanford and also in York County all the way to the right could potentially change. What I think is of note here is a majority of the job growth continues to be in some of the most competitive sectors that Eric talked about, so manufacturing, construction, and we see some rebounding in healthcare. But then there are some other interesting sectors like professional and technical services that continue to see growth, like management of companies and businesses continues to see growth. We see some rebounding in the sectors that were most impacted by COVID. So a lot of the sectors that are strong today will continue to be strengths, but then there are some emerging ones. Some of the emerging ones, like the professional, scientific, and technical services and the management, as you'll see later on, those tend to be much higher average incomes. So that's from our perspective on economic development, spending, household income, if those folks live and work here, that's a good sign. Those are also jobs that tend to be office focused. So if we're trying to think about how to fill space on Main Street or in the downtown, upper story space, first floor space with smaller office buildings, those are the kinds of job transitions that we like to see. One way that we start to think about how that employment change could be beneficial from a real estate perspective to Sanford is we take a look at, over that 10-year period from 2024 to 2034, how many jobs are expected to be gained or in some cases lost depending on the industry sector. Where we have job gains, so in this case we're looking at different industry sectors that tend to need or use industrial or manufacturing focused space. So we have manufacturing jobs, wholesale trade, we have transportation and warehousing, which would be like your logistics centers, like an Amazon center, for example, and then construction. And you can see over the 10 years, there's a little bit of job growth, so not a lot, about just less than 60 jobs. Most of that is focused in the manufacturing space. So what we do is we say, let's take manufacturing, for example. There's a job projection change of 56 jobs, job growth over the next 10 years. We multiply those 56 jobs by an average square footage per job. I think we use 750 square feet per job for manufacturing and industrial space. And that gets us a square footage demand projection of about a little over 41,000 square feet. So that's saying if we were to expand our job base in manufacturing by 56 jobs, that could potentially equate to a space demand, because those employees need space in order to work, of about 41,000 square feet. Now, I will say some of that will be absorbed by vacancies. So if you have vacant space in the town today that's industrial and it's marketable and usable, some of that could be that. It could be an expansion of an existing building where somebody's trying to expand their building and make it bigger and hire more people, or it could be brand new space. But overall, not a ton of demand, both at the local and the county level, based on the job projections. But again, this is just based on job projections. This has nothing to do if someone called up Keith and said, hey, I need a 100,000 square foot facility on 20 acres. Do you have that? Right? That would be totally different. That would be an amazing opportunity, but that's not this. So this is just looking at potential employment change. And then it also compares it to York County, just so you can see how it would compare to the county as a whole. The other thing that could be a potential for all the things I'm going to show you is if Sanford were able to rezone property for industrial, to market itself, to put infrastructure in place, to prepare land for those kinds of uses in the future, there's a potential that you could steal some of that growth from York County that might go elsewhere and redirect it to Sanford. So some of it is about what you have today. Some of it is, in our opportunity analysis, how do we prepare the city for the future? We also look at the office demand as well. So again, and not terribly surprising, office is a challenging market today. If you read anything in the news, their work from home has had pretty big impacts, just as well as changes in the economy. The interesting thing and we'll show this data a little later when we look at actual physical space, Sanford's market for office, for the most part, is actually in much smaller kind of professional office, personal service office, your lawyers, your medical office, dentists, doctors, architects, things like that. Those folks, at least as they are in Sanford today, those businesses don't tend to command 40,000 square foot offices with 400 people in them. They tend to employ, 5, 10, 15, 20 people at a time. They might be in spaces of 2, 3, 4,000 square feet. A lot of them are along Main Street in the downtown, in old converted homes along Main Street, so they tend to be on the smaller side. So seeing a future demand of maybe 18, 19,000 square feet or about 2,000 per year, to me, it sort of kind of fits in with the market that's kind of here in Sanford. So it seems to me like those things will just sort of continue to go. Again, this doesn't take into account if somebody said, wow, I want to relocate my office headquarters for, a bank or a company or a tech company or whatever it might be in Sanford. Again, amazing opportunity, but not necessarily captured in these numbers. And then the last one is just around retail, arts and entertainment, hotels, food services, beverage services, and other personal services. That would be like hair salons, nail salons, barbershops, things like that. Okay. So the pandemic has not necessarily been kind to most of these industry sectors. What we see is there's still demand for space, but with the pandemic, people doing early retirement, business closures, and also people just shifting jobs or reskilling or retraining, as we were talking about earlier. They've sort of moved out of some of these sectors and are doing something different because of the impacts of the pandemic. So because of that, businesses tend to be doing the same amount of business or more with fewer people, and that's translating into losses in employment nationwide in these sectors. So that's the only reason why I think we see that. I don't think it's because demand for those kinds of uses or those spaces are necessarily declining, as we'll see when we get into the real estate sector piece. I just think that because we do this analysis for this part based on employment, it's just showing that there's not necessarily employment growth or huge demand. Again, if the city does certain things to attract new retailers, new restaurateurs, new cafes, new bars, new barbershops to fill Main Street or fill downtown or mill locations, that will all be gravy on top of this, and that will be very different than what we're looking at here. But just in terms of employment projections, it seems like things will sort of hold steady over time. Okay, I'm just going to stop there and ask if that makes sense. Yes?
So I'm just curious on the projections. Obviously projections are based on historical data typically, but is there anything else that you've added into the numbers to come up with those projections?
Nothing on our side. We get that from the company that we subscribe to that does them nationwide.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
On the highly skilled professional, do you know how many are home workers? I can think of 3 off the top of my head, probably 200K plus their earnings that were in their houses pre-COVID. So they had already worked out, they wanted to live in this community, either they were raised here or whatever, and they are able to move with their jobs because it is so highly skilled and on the computer, and a couple of them I think do data crunching, so they can do it from home. So does that show any of that, living from home, which might impact what office space we might need, because those people are never going to have an office? So, or working from home, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we can add that. The way we typically get that information is through the census. Again, it'll lag a little bit because, as Eric was saying before, we have up to 2022 data. Obviously, the work from home change continues to evolve over time. But what we could do with that is we could go backwards a couple of census years, and we could look at the percentage of Sanford residents who were working from home at that point in time, and then we could sort of fast forward and look at 2022, the most recent year, and we could see how that's changed. My gut tells me, based on the fact that Eric showed that population bump from, I think, 2020 upward to 2022, and that I would imagine the change in home prices and home sale prices, you must have had a fair amount of people move to Sanford who either are super commuting or doing a hybrid schedule where they only have to commute to Portsmouth once a week or once a month, or they're just not at all.
And the reason I ask this question is because it obviously impacts where we talk about quality of life, things that we want to, make sure to encourage in certain sections of our community. So it's not about housing in that instance as much as it is about just amenities. So I think that's the reason it's a good piece of information, what kind of people are living here, working from home, don't need the office space, but they're here. And, we want to encourage more of them to be here because they are a good price point for income,
Right.
so.
Yeah. So in terms of amenities, like what might they need during the day or on the weekend? Yep. Yeah.
The only thing I want to point out is I did notice like government jobs are projected to go down. And what I found interesting about that, and I understand that the data came from a national company, but the shipyard just built and is building 2 brand new dry docks and planning on hiring 2,000 employees, all skill-based employees. And so it's surprising me that the shipyard employees account for at least half of the employees in the government sector. And to add 2,000 jobs, but to see the government number go down by 400, it seems like that might be a little bit off.
That is a recent development.
Yeah, that's probably why. Yeah, they do the best they can to adjust them. Also, would those jobs be located in York County or okay, they would be. Okay, great. Okay, anything else? Okay, cool. Great questions, thank you. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about physical space, supply and demand of physical space, price points. So all of the data that we'll share comes from CoStar, if you've ever heard of them. They're a national firm. I think the best out there. Their whole job is they've got thousands of people who are scouring the internet, calling brokers all over the country and trying to figure out what's being built, what's being demolished, at what price point, when is it going to be built, when is it going to be completed, and they put all that into nice charts for us so that we can interpret it and figure out what's happening in the local market. So this, you'll see, I'll go more slowly through industrial, but the charts that we show for each of the land use sectors will look the same, so I'll explain it here. If you have any questions, just let me know. So this first chart, which you'll see again later on, compares three things. And I should say, because of where Sanford is situated, all of the market data is for York County. That happens to be the CoStar market that Sanford falls within. But recognizing that Sanford is one of the larger places and has a lot more space than some of the more rural towns, I think it's a good reflection of what's probably happening in Sanford. So this chart shows the orange bars are what's called net absorption. So if the orange bar is going upward, that means space is being leased and taken off the market. So that's a good thing if the orange bars are going up. If the orange bars are coming down, that means someone is vacating that property and it's no longer being occupied, so that would be bad. Or it could mean that there was something delivered and it's not leased up yet. The blue lines are what's called net deliveries. So that's if somebody built something new, the blue line is going to go up. If somebody took something off the market and either demolished it, or let's say they switched it from an industrial building to an office building, that would also be a negative net delivery because we're going from one space type to a different one. So anything going up is usually good. Anything on the downside is usually bad. And the green line, that sort of jagged green line, is just the vacancy rate. So that's how much space do you have in the community in total versus how much space, that would be the denominator in the equation. The numerator in the equation would be how much space is actively available for lease that someone could lease up and move into. The lower that green line, the better. The higher that green line, the worse. So that's vacancy going up versus vacancy coming down. Typically what you'll see is when net deliveries go up, when somebody builds something new, vacancy is going to go up because as they're building it, it's not leased up yet. So those trends tend to go together. When absorption, the orange line goes up, vacancy tends to come down because we're absorbing or leasing or occupying that space. Therefore, your vacancy number is going to come down. So as we're seeing, basically from 2015 through about 2022, for all the industrial space in the York County market, vacancy is like historically low for industrial and manufacturing space. This is a trend that we're seeing all over, particularly in New England. A lot of that is based on sort of reshoring of manufacturing, but also during COVID, we built and needed an incredible amount of transportation and logistics space. If you think about all the Amazon warehouses, Targets, Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmarts, they all these developers built those for those companies, and they did it in a very short period of time and delivered a lot of them in a short period of time, basically like 2020. It kind of started a little before COVID, but COVID just made it go crazy because everybody had to be home. Home deliveries went nuts, and people needed a place to store, companies needed a place to store all that stuff so they could get it to your door within a day or two. So we saw a lot of that. So we saw net deliveries happen, which are those blue lines, and we saw a ton of absorption happen, which are the orange lines. Because so much space was absorbed, vacancy went from about 9% in 2015 to less than 1% in 2022, which is crazy low. But a good thing if we're thinking about growth in manufacturing in Sanford and York County, if we don't have a lot of space that can be offered today, that could be an opportunity for someone to come in and maybe build more of that space over time. The graph on the right just shows that vacancy rate that I was talking about that went from 9% to 1%. CoStar breaks it down by different types of industrial space. So specialized would kind of be your purpose-built manufacturing space. So somebody needs to build widget A, and they need a very specific space to build widget A. That would be your specialized space. Your logistics space would be that transportation and warehousing space that I was talking about before, your Amazon warehouse. And then flex space is really interesting. Flex space, and when you get the presentation, I have a definition in small type on the slide, but if you think about, if you had a 100,000 square foot building, maybe 50% of it is being used for building something or manufacturing something. 25% is like front office space for some workers who aren't doing manufacturing. Maybe another 15% is you have a retail area where you can sell something that you're making, and then you've got some storage and warehouse in the back. So flex space is something that can be divided up and used for a whole bunch of different uses in a single building footprint. So I thought what was interesting on this is specialized space and flex space are rock bottom. That's what's driving the vacancy down a ton in York County. So very popular. There's also not a lot of it. So the vacancy has gone from, in the case of specialized, nearing 9.5% down to like less than 1%. But I thought it was interesting for the logistics space, which is the blue line. There's a lot of volatility in that line. We see a huge spike, then a huge dip as we're going through the pandemic, an even bigger dip as we hit 2022, and then the projections over the next 3 years are for that vacancy to come back up again. We had a tendency around the country to sort of overbuild that space. I think a lot of developers saw that as a great idea, and at the time it was, but it was basically how fast can you get that to market, and can you lease it up? And so it was sort of a race to do that, and some of the developers who were building that space then ended up with some vacancy or a bunch of vacancy. So I think that's why the projections are sort of to come back up again. So the focus, I think, for York County would be good on sort of purpose-built space, and I think the flexible space is really interesting. As you're thinking about zoning, for example, on the flex space, making sure you have some flexibility within your zoning to allow different uses in the same building, maybe in your industrial district. So maybe some ways to tie the land use discussion together. This one you'll see in all the slides. So this just compares vacancy to asking rents. So as vacancy comes down, we typically see rents going up. It's sort of a supply and demand curve. The rents are crazy. They are all over New England for industrial space. In the case of York County, they went from like $525 a square foot, which was typical, in most normal markets. The projections are for it to approach almost $10 a square foot. It's almost a doubling in 10 years, which is pretty incredible. On one hand, it makes it more expensive for someone to do business because now they got to pay that rent. But on the developer side, it could offer an opportunity for them to actually turn a profit by building that building, just given how high interest rates are right now and also how high construction costs have gone. They kind of need those higher rents to be able to pay to build those buildings. So in some respects, the high rents are a good indicator of development feasibility from a financing standpoint, but the higher those rents go, sometimes it stretches how much someone can actually pay in a given market. But these rents are very typical to what we're seeing in a lot of different places. And then just to dig down into Sanford a little bit, so CoStar, they try to track as much inventory and as much vacant space as they can. They don't, I will caveat this by saying they don't capture every single space that might be vacant in a community or in a geography, so I will caveat these numbers with that. But according to CoStar, there's about 2.5 million square feet of industrial and flex space in Sanford today. And there's only 2 spaces, according to CoStar, that are actively being leased. One is on One Eagle Drive. It's a 97,000 square foot building, and there's about 11,000 square feet available, and they're asking rents about $8 a square foot. And there's about 25,000 square feet out of 42,000 at 41 Industrial Ave. So again, if the information from CoStar represents what you're seeing in the community, I would say this represents a very, very, very low vacancy rate out of 2.5 million square feet that's in the inventory. The other, just as we're thinking about, if you're thinking about zoning or sort of the development side of the comp plan, the average building size, just to give you perspective on that, in Sanford's about 57,000 square feet, give or take. So if you're thinking about how much area to zone, how you should maybe set the zoning, these are sometimes some good parameters. Average parking ratio today as built is around 2.5 per thousand. Typical floor height's about 15 feet or more. Sometimes they want to see it go a lot more depending on the use. The other thing I thought was interesting was in CoStar, they have a mapping element where we can map available spaces around York County, which are those blue diamonds that you see in the map. And then if you can see it, there's kind of like blue fuzzy areas on the map. It's kind of like a hotspot map. That shows you where there's a lot of inventory around York County. So not that it's vacant or available, just built square footage of industrial space. And, you know, as someone who doesn't live here, I thought it was kind of interesting to see where the concentrations of built space but also available space are. And they tend to kind of be clustered right now, at least with what's available, kind of coming south out of Portland on 95 and Route 1, coming down through Saco and Biddeford, and then a little bit down into Wells. And then sort of as you come over to the South Berwick-Somersworth area, there's a couple, but not a whole lot in the sort of more central part of the county. Obviously, you see Sanford and the 2 spaces I talked about closer to the airport and the industrial park on that map, but not a whole lot else. So as we start to think about opportunities for industrial space, you know, what are the unique assets about Sanford that are different than these other locations that the city could market? Obviously, we have the airport, but do we have the zoning in place? Do we have land? Do we have infrastructure? You know, are those things in place or things that we could think about putting in place and could be marketed to make Sanford an even stronger industrial market than it is today? Okay, I'll stop there.
So much information.
Okay. Office. So same concepts. Absorption, deliveries, and vacancy. The interesting thing with office is in York County, even with the pandemic, absorption has been positive. Even in the face of some small net deliveries, absorption's been fairly positive. And since about 2020, it's sort of driving the vacancy rate down. Based again on what CoStar tracks, so again, it might not be everything, but the vacancy rate in the York County submarket was 1.6%. And that's actually lower than the Portland office market, which is currently at about 4%. Now that could be the types of office, you know, Portland obviously being probably a more robust office market, but just to say there's probably room for, you know, some small office, again, going back to the employment projections and typical office floor plates and space size, it will probably be more on the smaller professional office side. And interestingly, rents have also been rising as vacancy's been coming down, and we'll show you what that looks like too. But actually some positive signs, I think, on the office market, but particularly on the smaller office market side. So this again shows the asking rents against the vacancy. So asking rents in blue, vacancy rate coming up and down in the orange. So again, as we see the vacancy rate coming down toward that 1%, 1 to 2% mark, asking rents have shot up by quite a bit. Forecasts show the vacancy rate kind of a little bit coming up, but sort of leveling off around the 2% mark, and then that will sort of create a leveling off of rents. Now, that doesn't mean that if somebody built some Class A office space brand new, that they wouldn't get top of market rents, but generally for your market, I think rents will sort of level out, and that's probably what we'll see going forward. And then I was just thinking a little bit about Sanford and how low the vacancy rate for office, at least at CoStar tracks, is. The total inventory is just shy of 500,000 square feet. What's listed in CoStar as vacant and available is about 2,500 square feet, so probably 1 or 2 spaces. And the average asking rent is pretty good at $19 a square foot, at least based on what CoStar is tracking. And as I was thinking about those like typical sizes of office buildings, I wanted to pull, the map on the right is from CoStar. It shows all of the existing inventory in those silver diamonds, and then the blue diamonds are where you have the one is sort of hidden up there, just north of downtown. The other one you can clearly see out on 224. But it's like all of that office space is generally concentrated mostly along Main Street, basically from James Avenue, then all the way up to Charles Street. And a lot of the office spaces, I think, tend to be a little bit older. They tend to be in like converted, it looks like converted houses or sort of older buildings that have been converted. And again, not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think it just speaks to the type of market that's been here historically, so smaller spaces and older spaces. But I think there might be an opportunity to kind of continue that trend, and maybe there's a focus in the downtown area, trying to fill spaces there. Okay, 2 more. Retail, so similar chart again, absorptions, deliveries, and vacancy. Not surprising, you'll see vacancy come down as we approach the pandemic and then sort of shoot back up again. That's that green line during the pandemic. That's just a result of, businesses going in, businesses going out as a result of closures and reopenings during COVID. But the good thing is, we're on the path to recovery and sort of where we were pre-COVID, just in terms of vacancy and also in terms of rents, which I'll show on the next slide. So vacancies have come down. They're projected to kind of hover in that like 2% range, 1.8 to 2.0 range, which is good. Historically, that's kind of been where the vacancy rate has been over the last 20 years. It's been in that 2% range. So I think things are kind of returning back to normal. We also can look at vacancy by different types of retail, similar to what we did with industrial. So we looked at, in this case, I tried to pick ones that I think are present here in Sanford. You don't have a giant mall, at least not that I saw, so I took that one off the chart. But we looked at neighborhood centers, which that would be kind of like where Hannaford is. That would be sort of a neighborhood center where you've got a couple big anchors and then a bunch of inline tenants. So that would be your green line. Your yellow line would be your strip centers, so that would kind of be your smaller strip malls, maybe your 5 to 8,000 square foot, 5 or 6 stores, usually tend to be more locally owned. And then general retail would kind of be your standalone retail stores that might be one-off retail stores, like an AutoZone that might just stand on its own, for example. So in this, you can see vacancy for strip centers and also general retail continuing to be very low, but the neighborhood centers actually coming up a little bit, and I'll show you a little bit more about why I think that is. Total vacancy, again, against market asking rents. Asking rents are going up as vacancy is coming back down, so similar trend to what we saw before. So the other thing that we wanted to do in terms of retail, besides just looking at how things are doing in the market, is to think about Sanford as a retail destination. I think there's no doubt that when you first come into the city, there's a lot of retail, a lot of big box retail, grocery stores. Sanford, from what I can see and understand, is kind of a prime retail hub, especially for a lot of people from the more rural locations around the city who want to come in and buy things. What we looked at is a comparison of retail sales, so that would be for every store, retail and restaurant that's located in the city. How much money do they make by selling whatever it is they sell? So that would be the sales side. The retail demand side is within Sanford, how much spending occurs by the people who live in Sanford across these different retail categories. Where the percentage is over 100%, that means that that retail category is drawing people in to the community to buy stuff. Where it's below 100%, it means there's more spending from people who live in Sanford leaving Sanford. So if you think about building and hardware, you've got a Lowe's, you've got a hardware store in downtown. There probably aren't those things elsewhere around the county, or at least not in close proximity. So if somebody needs to go to Lowe's, they're probably coming here to do that. That's why you see that number of 351% so high. It means they're importing almost 3 times as much spending power as you have in the city today. Same with grocery stores at 264. I think you have 2 large format grocery stores here. People are probably coming in to shop at, I think, the Hannaford's and the Shaw's. That's why you see you're importing almost, 2.6 times as much spending as people in Sanford are spending on grocery. Does that make sense? For apparel, that would be like, it could be anything from a Macy's to a small format boutique shop, clothing shop. It could be anything in there. I didn't see a ton of that in Sanford, so I'm guessing people are going to larger format malls or other kinds of power centers to go to a Kohl's or a Macy's or wherever they're going. So that's why you see there's a lot of people taking their spending power on apparel and they're leaving. And they're spending it somewhere else because those stores don't exist here. So that's what the graphic on the left shows. And the way we like to look at that is, well, there could be some opportunities to try and capture that spending here. If it's at 21%, today, is there an opportunity to bring that to 50% by potentially trying to market to or introduce some other kind of apparel store that doesn't exist elsewhere that maybe could exist here? Yeah.
Hi. What does GMDSE mean?
General merchandise.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank
So it
you.
would kind of be like miscellaneous stuff. Yeah, good question.
I actually had a question too, Eric.
Yeah.
Where would you place Walmart on this category if people are using Walmart for groceries as well as hardware and sports and pharmacy?
Yeah,
Apparel.
they've got a little bit
Right.
of everything, don't they?
They do, yeah.
That's actually a great question. I'm not 100% sure where they would land. It's
Okay.
general, right?
That's the general merch.
I think it would be general.
Right. So probably like the Martins and a Walmart would be the entire category of
Could
that
be, yeah.
general merchandise.
Yeah, it could be, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yep. Thanks, sir.
Another question over there. Make sure your mic's on, please, Matt. Thanks.
How was the vacancy rate measured? You said it's like relatively very low, but I don't know, maybe I just don't observe it that way. How did you guys, what's the measure for that?
Yeah, I had a feeling this might come up. So the vacancy rate, by the way, CoStar measures it, is they take the entire, let's say for retail, for example, they take the entire square footage of retail in this case, in York County. So let's just say that number is 100 square feet. Obviously, it's much bigger than that, but for math's sake, let's say it's 100 square feet. And what they're tracking as vacant and like actively being, actively up for lease, like someone's actually marketing the property and they capture it. Let's say that's 10 square feet. So you would take 10 over 100, or the vacancy rate would be 10%. So that's how they calculate that. Now, I recognize, 'cause we've been here, we've toured around, like downtown, there are some vacant storefronts and elsewhere. So it depends on how those spaces either, I guess one question is, are they being actively leased and marketed, and to what degree? And then does CoStar sort of pick that up through the different brokerage sites and websites that they use? So that's why I caveated in the beginning that CoStar tracks some stuff, but it doesn't get everything. So the way we try to supplement that is, we've done a site walk. Aaron took us around on a driving tour. We're also talking to folks that are here locally, brokers, property owners and stuff, to try to get some more qualitative information about local conditions.
What, excuse me, what year is CoStar's data coming from?
We pulled from second quarter 2024.
We have seen more growth in our retail stuff this year, and also a lot of our downtown vacancies are small spaces. We have Walmart, which is basically 110,000 square feet. And then we have like 5 or 6 right next to City Hall here, but each of them are only like 500 square feet each.
Yep, totally. Yeah. So CoStar may not pick up on those. It just depends on how the property owner is marketing them, and then are they able to pick that up? Yeah, good question. Okay. So just really quick, the graphic on the right-hand side where it says estimated supportable square footage at 30%. So what we did for the same categories that you see on the graph with the green bars is we said of all the household spending that's taking place in Sanford, and then all the spending that's leaving Sanford from those households, so apparel being a great example of this, what happens if we could capture just 30% of the spending that's leaving Sanford from Sanford households? So those households are driving somewhere else, they're shopping and spending their money in those categories at some other store in some other city or town. What if we could offer something here where we could capture more of their spending so they could spend it here and not leave? So we took all the spending that's leaving across the categories where it is leaving, and we said, what if we could capture 30% of that? We use typical sale volumes per square foot, and we translate that into supportable square foot of potential. So for example, if we were able to capture just 30% of the apparel spending that's leaving, that could potentially support 7,000 square feet of apparel stores. That could be in a vacant storefront downtown already, or it could be a newly built space. Yeah.
How does CoStar or whoever the source take into account online shopping?
There's a whole separate category for.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking from an apparel and even some of
Yeah.
the sports stuff. I bet you would say that the money is not just leaving Sanford, it's on the internet. So I don't know if that's something that we can necessarily capture, but want to kind of note that.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, and they have a whole number that I don't have on here that talks about online retailing and shopping. Yep, and how much money is being spent. But good question.
But that's not what this chart is showing, right? Like where the apparel is high in the red, that is people spending at brick and mortar stores
Exactly, yeah.
elsewhere.
Yeah, it's like sales that are taking place at brick and mortar stores because
Separate out.
yeah, they separate it out. This source separates it out.
So good. But I guess I'm confused. If you could go, I don't know if whoever's.
Yeah, Ben, can you show the slide? Thanks.
So how is it even possible, for example, for apparel, that, what does the 6978 represent, square footage? Like, does that just mean they're going to Portland to some of the, like,
Yeah, they might go to,
Stores there?
yep, or go to a mall or wherever they're, yeah.
okay,
Yep.
LL Bean?
Yep,
Okay.
totally, yeah.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand, like, Sanford's not an apparel town.
Yep. So I just want to show you what the opportunities are, and then as we think about the next step, comments like that are very helpful because you may never want to write a strategy that does that, yeah.
Saying if we were just trying to capture 30% of what we're losing
Yep.
out of our community, we should add about 7,000 square foot of space for apparel.
Yep, or you could fill vacant space, or another way that could happen is, let's say you have a store that doesn't carry apparel today, but maybe they're very interested in creating a niche apparel line. They could also diversify their product type, which would help that too. So it could be brand new built space, could be backfilling vacancies, or it could be an existing merchant that diversifies their product line. So there's a lot of different ways in which they could do that, yeah. Okay, I might just skip through some of this just for the sake of time. So, all right, last section is just about housing. So we'll start with single family, then we'll go into multifamily. I'll go quickly through this because I'm guessing nothing's going to be surprising, but if it is, let me know. Prices over the last 10 years have gone up like crazy. We've basically gone from about $200,000 a year for a median sale price to just bordering $500,000 a year in like 10 years. This is definitely not unique to Sanford, although I recognize it's a huge problem. Well, for some people it's a huge problem. For others who are gaining equity, it might not be. It's definitely a double-edged sword. But just to point out that prices have gone up, and we'll show you some of that impact on the employment side in a minute. Inventory is really, really low. In a typical month, we may have seen 50 or 60 houses on the market. Now we're seeing maybe 20 if we're lucky. So not only have, and that's one of the reasons why prices have gone up, because people aren't selling. Part of it is interest rates. Part of it is if you're an older adult, where do you go? And where do you go for an equivalent or hopefully less price than what your house is going to sell for? And also, if you're someone who's looking to get into the housing market and buy, and you're on the younger side, can you come up with a down payment? Can you afford the interest? Can you afford the price? And everything else that comes along with home buying? It's a lot to take on right now. The other thing is median days on market, which is on the left, is something that we like to talk about too. So we show Sanford in green, York County in red. Median days on market back in 2015, 2016, a house might have been on the market for 3 months. Now houses are on the market for a week. It's causing price competition and price escalation like crazy. And a lot of that happened between 2020 and 2023. The reason we're seeing some inventory start to come up, I think, is a result of the interest rates that went up so much in the last year. And then just if you happen to own a home, you're in a good position. Home values year over year have been going up like 10%. During COVID, you can see how much those prices went up. They jumped by almost 25% in 1 year, which is crazy. And again, this has happened all over. So that's a little bit about multifamily. I would say if you build it, they will come. So, for the housing section, think about, if that's something desirable for the community. I don't think you'll have a problem selling it. For multifamily, we use CoStar, again, just to track, same as we did before. So not surprisingly, there's really nothing going down. So nobody's taking units off the market and nobody's really vacating units. If you're in a unit, you're probably staying there. And if you vacate a unit, it gets leased up very quickly. So the interesting thing for York County is the blue lines represent new deliveries. So in 2021, for example, you see a blue line go up, and then there's another big blue line in 2023, another big blue line at the end of 2023. Those are people building multifamily apartments somewhere in York County. So there's been a net delivery of about 560 units across that time period, with about another 134 slated in 2024 across the county. The crazy thing is, when they're adding 560 units, it's taking like 3 to 6 months to lease up. So they build it, it leases. So you'll see the spike in vacancy. It goes up to like 11%. But that's because they built a whole bunch, but then that vacancy rate comes crashing back down to 5% within 6 to 9 months. So even though we're building a bunch, and it might feel like we're building a bunch, to me, when I look at this, it's like it's not enough. There's so much demand for housing, particularly for rental housing. When people can't afford to get into the for sale market, what other choice do they have? It's you got to rent, or you got to own, or you got to go live with somebody else who's already doing that. So there's kind of those three choices. So it was really interesting to see this. Even though there's net deliveries, the vacancy rate just comes right back down again, and it sits in that 5 to 6% range, which is also historically low for York County. Not surprisingly, prices just continue to go up and up. Back in 2014, an average price for a multifamily unit might have been about $1,400. Now we're creeping up over $1,900, and again, in a short period of time. So similar to ownership rates or ownership prices, rents have gone up exponentially as well. And that's been true across almost every bedroom type. So studios, 1s, 2s, and 3s, they're all trending up. The really interesting thing, I was thinking about this, is typically we see 3-bedroom rents just on a monthly basis. They're usually, I don't know, $500, $800 higher than a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom, because you're typically leasing 1,200 square feet, 1,400 square feet. So you would expect the price to be more than if you're leasing up an 800 square foot 1-bedroom. Just makes sense. But here in York County, the 3-bedrooms actually have a lower monthly rent on average than a 1 and 2. So as I was thinking about why that might be, I'm assuming there's fewer 3-bedroom units, and the ones that are here are much older, so the price points are probably much lower. Typically, what we see from the development side is everybody wants to build 1s and 2s. That's where you make your most money on a per square foot basis, and they tend to lease up pretty quickly. You don't make as much money on the development side from a 3-bedroom. And studios, like in the right market, they're really good. In some markets, they don't necessarily work as well. Some people don't want to live in 500 square feet, even as a single person. So it was just interesting to see that from a price and production standpoint. So just digging into Sanford, again, this is just what CoStar tracks. They track just under 900 multifamily units. They're saying, at least with the data that they have, there wasn't anything under construction at the time. Of all those units that they're tracking, about 2% are currently up for rent, which is crazy low. It's 4 percentage points lower than the York County submarket. Average asking rents are around $1,150 a month. That's across all bedroom types and unit types. But the market does tend to more heavily skew toward 1 and 2 bedroom units, which is not surprising. We see a lot of that. And most of the multifamily properties in Sanford tend to be kind of around the downtown and the neighborhoods, also around Number One Pond and some of those surrounding neighborhoods too. Okay, a couple more if you'll bear with me. The other thing we wanted to do was just talk about potential housing demand from the population standpoint. As Eric talked about before, population is projected to continue to grow in Sanford, which I think is a good thing. But if we're going to have more people here, and we already know vacancy is really, really tight, we probably need more housing. So what we did was we looked at what a typical owner household size was in 2017, and then again in 2022 from the census. And owner household sizes have actually dropped a little bit, while the average renter household size has gone up a little bit, which is kind of interesting. Usually we see either both of them drop or we see the renters drop more often than not. But renters went up, which tells me there's probably more 2 and 3 person households shifting toward renter occupied units, which might signify to me with the price changes that they just can't get into an owner occupied unit. The prices might be too high, or there's just nothing on the market. So if you're a family of 3 or 4, you might have to rent either because of the price or the availability, or you might choose to do that. There's a lot of different reasons. I think that's why we're seeing the renter household size go up a little bit. So what we did was we took the 2020 population from the decennial census, the full count, and then we looked at Maine State economists. So the state of Maine, they provide population projections out to the year 2040 for every community across the state. So according to them, Sanford's population over the next 20 years could grow by just under 2,000 people. So if we applied an average household size of about 2.5 persons per household, kind of a blend between the owner and the renter, that could mean future demand if all those new people form new households, about 718 housing units to house that population, just based on that average household size. And then if we split it based on the owner and renter split today, as Eric said, it's about 68% owner, 32% renter. If we use those splits, that could be potential demand for just under 500 new owner units, 240 renter units. One interesting thing is we're seeing in a lot of communities over time, the split of owner-renter is coming down on the owner side and up on the renter side. A lot of that is just a function of more rental units being built than ownership units. So the demand that we show here, it could potentially change over time. But I think the good news is if the city's interested in housing, I think there's demand here. Okay, last 2 slides. One thing we want to look at, because this is the economic development chapter and why housing is important, is we need to make sure that people who work here can live here. That's a good thing for employers. It's a good marketing ploy for employers in the city. So what we did was we looked at all the different industry sectors. We looked at the jobs in 2024 that are in those industry sectors and what the average earning per job is across those industry sectors. We translated those average earnings per job to what someone could afford for a home price, just using standard we used the FHA down payment of 3.5%, today's interest rates, today's insurance costs, things like that. And we translated, for example, if somebody was making $103,000, they could roughly afford a house around $400,000. Or they could afford a rent of just under $2,600 a month by using 30% of their income, which is a standard housing affordability measure. And then all the way on the right, I just said, based on these industry sectors and these average earnings, could someone actually afford the average rent today in Sanford, which I said was $1,150. So you can see when we look at it, industry sectors, and it's averaging the most high-paying jobs in those sectors and the most low-paying jobs in those sectors. There's about 3 sectors: retail, trade, accommodations and food services, and then the other personal and professional services, where they actually, they would struggle to afford the rent today as it is. We like to take this a step further because when we look at, let's say when we look at, what would be a good example? Like retail trade is a good example of this. If we take the average earnings per job, you might have a manager of a retail store making $75,000. You might have an hourly worker making $22,000. And that's across the whole retail industry. And then we average those salaries to get that number. But when we look at then occupations, so this actually looks at what a worker is doing for their job. So not what industry they work in, but what they're doing. So if you're in accommodations and food services, you could be a manager, you could be a plant manager, but you could also be a food preparation and server, which is actually almost 1,100 of those jobs. That's what someone's actually doing within that industry sector, and you can see how much it changes. Those folks only make $36,000 a year. That translates to an affordable rent of $900 a month. They couldn't afford $1,150, which is what the current average in Sanford is. So when we look at what people are actually doing and what they're actually making, you can see how quickly the affordability story, it changes. It shifts a lot. So as you're thinking about the role that housing plays, not only for housing's sake, but also for economic development's sake, we like to look at this because it's important. Okay. Questions? I know we threw a lot at you. I hope you were able to bear with us. I appreciate your time. We will send all this to Erin tomorrow morning.
Yes, Keith has a question. Oh, sorry, I have the microphone.
So maybe we're going to address this, but what are next steps for you on this? I mean, this is not the completed sort of action plan, so I wonder if you can give us kind of a summary on where you're going from here and what you kind of expect from a final form of this report and what that's going to look like.
Sure, yeah. So next steps is weeding through all of the information, continuing to weed, add some of the questions that we heard tonight, the pieces around tourism, for example, Keith, and then start to really hone in on the next section, which is all about what are the opportunities that we see. So that'll be looking at what industry sectors and job types might Sanford be well positioned for. What types of spaces do you have available today, and what kinds of land availability do you have? I know when we met, we talked a lot about that. What are the assets that you have, and what sort of marketing opportunities does that bring into play, and start to bring all of this together and talk about opportunities at the next meeting and potential strategies to capitalize on those.
So with the housing issue, is that, and I don't know if you're the one that would decide what to do with this exactly, but is that something that we need to remedy, or is that something that we kind of just need to work around? Like, is it even possible to remedy it? Because, yeah. Like, I guess, is the strategy going to be, I guess the main strategy going to be to try to fix the housing situation, or is it going to be like, we'll try to work on it, but for now we're going to focus on trying to go around it?
I'm not going to speak to what the city wants to do, because I haven't been part of the housing conversation. That's a separate piece, but I would say, I think it'd be important to focus on not only what do you want to do, but what role can the city and or its partners play in chipping away at the housing challenge. Housing markets don't stop at a community's border. Housing challenges tend to be much bigger. So I think we're from Massachusetts. Our housing problem is as real as it gets. And we have this conversation all the time. A community say, well, what can we really do about it? I say, just do your part. Chip away at it. Do what you can. Rezone land. Try to create subsidy for the folks who really need it. Just try to do what you can. recognizing that it's going to take a regional and a state and really a national effort to try to get us out of where we are.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make a point that the shipyard in Kittery is the major, in Sanford, that's the major employer for Sanford. And there's manufacturing workers there, and there's technical and engineering workers there. So I don't know how the data is drawn, but, when we're seeing the manufacturing and the engineers, those could be coming from the shipyard, a lot of those numbers, right? So you're not going to bring those jobs back, back to Sanford. So,
Yep, so when we show the county data, those
Yeah.
jobs are captured, with the exception of what was mentioned earlier with the 2,000 new jobs coming. One thing that we had talked to Aaron about and a couple of other folks when we were here a while back was, is there any possibility to find out, are there things being done at the shipyard that, not that we would move it here, but that could be synergistic with something that could happen here? So like, is there some kind of like a supply chain that happens where somebody's doing something that the shipyard needs in what they're doing? And is there any like synergy with those two things where, we might not move government or shipyard jobs to Sanford, but it could be like, I don't know, some kind of metal fabrication or electronics fabrication or something that they need there to do what they're doing, but it could be done here and just sent over there, so that we could grow jobs here, capitalize on the folks who are here, or bring people here. So that's something that we want to look at.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one of the major constraints is the shipyard is on an island. Real estate is a constraint. And so when you add a dry dock, all the auxiliary functions and manufacturing and redoing parts, it gets all exported off the island. Or it's going to have to be when you start increasing production.
Yep. Yep.
So correlating two of the tables that you had in there, so, you're going to bring back for us opportunities that we have to capture various industries and such under that. You showed us a slide earlier of the industries that are paying that wage that gets us above ALICE, right? Above the ALICE rating, whatnot. So when you identify the opportunities that we might be able to capture, I'd like to know for that industry sector, if that's a sector that pays that above living wage so they can afford to be here or not. So for example, our industrial council is working on the expansion of the industrial park. It's focused on information technology because it's a higher paying job and there's a greater economic multiplier to it than some of our more traditional manufacturing forms that predominate here. So it's those kind of efforts that gets us net gains in there, so.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you guys, both of you, for your presentation. It's super helpful. Like I said before, this is all going to be part of the market analysis chapter. It'll have a separate standalone plan, but then we'll be incorporating a good chunk of the findings and what those next steps mean for the community. Our next meeting, we'll be talking more about zoning and land use and kind of trying to piece together those pieces before they come back and give us some of the kind of opportunities and next steps findings. I did hand out an activity. We're not going to do it right now, but if you could take it with you, I will also email it to you. Basically, one of the steps of the public engagement process is to survey the community. So I didn't give you the full questions in the full survey, but I kind of broke down the different topics that we'll be asking about and tried to give some cliff notes on some of those questions, what they will be. I don't have it in front of me right now. So for instance, we're going to start off with just saying like what's your relation to Sanford? Do you live here? You work here? Where do you spend your most time in the area? Then we'll be getting into some of our, let's say, city services. We want to get some not hard facts, I guess, but we want to hear from the community as far as if they're satisfied with the roads, the sidewalks. I know a lot of that was covered in the SS4A, but we might be hitting a different portion of the population, which is our goal. whether or not people have access to all the goods and services that they need. So while RKG is working on the data and trying to get that as much as possible, we're going to get the qualitative data and try to hear from as many people as possible. Transportation, how do you get to and from to work? Is your current mode of transportation what you actually prefer? Are you interested in alternative forms of transportation? Is there enough parking where you're going? Housing, again, your current and preferred options, and also your plans for the future. Are you planning to age in Sanford? Are you planning to buy a house in the next 5 years? So questions along those lines. Parks and Rec, whether or not you're using our current facilities, and if you're not, if you're leaving to use the facility somewhere else in a different community, or what you'd like to see here in the future. So that might be, while we're not on the beach, we do have land available, and maybe we have some sort of destination recreation opportunity here in Sanford. I think that's a huge opportunity, actually. So we'll have questions about that. Placemaking and identity, what's your favorite thing about Sanford? Describe Sanford in 3 words. Those are always interesting. If you could change one thing about Sanford, what would it be? We had a little bit of that kind of activity last meeting when we did the SWOT analysis and we talked about our strengths and weaknesses. I would be prepared to hear some negative comments in that portion of the survey, but that is still good data and we will work through that. And then I usually close out the survey with just a generic, some demographics, so we can do some cross coordination as far as, all the females that are 65 plus say they want a rock climbing wall as the destination because we're cool. And so then we can kind of cross-correlate the different demographic data with what the answers were to those questions. So I know I didn't list out what those questions are, but if you can kind of brainstorm yourself what you'd like to hear about the community, whether it's a topic or if you have a specific question, like, I want to know where you take your dog for a walk. I don't know, something like that. Are people using the dog park here? No, why not? I don't know, something like that. So if you can brainstorm some questions, 3 would be great. More is fine. You don't have to write it on the paper. You can just email them to me if you want. I will send this out to you tomorrow. And then we will work on building that community survey to send out later this summer to the wider public. Question?
That's going to be my question, is that how is it going to, I mean, you're going to, renters, owners, how's the message, how's the survey going to get out?
Yep, so I believe I have to look at the budget. We're going to use an online digital software, but also a paper format. Right, exactly. Usually I use Typeform. It's just a digital software that allows you to build those surveys in and has some of that, can auto-populate some of those graphs and charts, which we love so much.
It's going to go to head of household, as we were talking about earlier. Who's going to be allowed to take the survey?
Anyone's allowed, right? So even if you don't live in Sanford, that's an interesting fact to me. Like, we had a number of people that are commuting into Sanford, right? They don't live here, but they work here. They can still go to the grocery store. Why don't they live here? Do they want to live here? What kind of dog park do they want to go to? Right, exactly. So it'll be broadly advertised. We'll have printed copies at, like, definitely at City Hall, also other places that people will visit, like the library, let's say.
Okay. Use our government services to broadly.
Right.
If I'm paying my tax bill.
Yes, exactly.
Somebody to take a survey.
Yes. I have even in the past made little like drink coasters and dropped them off at bars and restaurants that have a little QR code that you can take our survey.
Exactly. I think
So-
it's all great ideas to get the highest amount of response, because you don't want just, the same people taking the survey.
Correct, yep. So our goal is to get as many as possible. We'll have it open for a good chunk of time and we'll keep pushing it out. We'll work with Jordan to get that out on our digital web presence. Yes, Renee? I know, I'm holding, you need this mic on too, yep. Thank you.
When do you need the brainstormed questions in by? What's the deadline?
I would say like in the next 2 weeks would be great. I know we have a holiday next week. It's coming up quick, so people are probably on vacation, but I'll send some reminder emails out. I can send this tomorrow. I'm not sure if we'll have this slide deck from tonight tomorrow, but that'll come out also. And then potentially have it printed for you and all for the next meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we will wrap up. We're almost 8 o'clock. Sorry for going over. There's a lot of information. Appreciate you guys for sticking with us. Motion to adjourn, Jack. Thank you.